Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to COASTER-net Update. We've got some breaking news out of Kings Island, where this morning they officially announced the closing of Firehawk. Now, Danny, we were speculating just a few days ago as to what ride this would ultimately be. We cited on the side of Firehawks that was the most likely answer, but a few interesting points about this. That number one, and we might have mentioned this before, but I think the most interesting point is, and something that, bears to be answered, is the rumor we heard that it wasn't going to be closing for this season. The rumor earlier in the season was that it was going to be closing next season, after next season. So I guess the first question is, well, why, one, are they closing Firehawk? And two, why are they closing it now as opposed to later on? Because they're not immediately using this space for anything that we know of. But there's always that Giga Flyer, B&M rumor out there that we talked about. I just assumed it was going to be an X space, and I thought they would go around, Firehawk to build that ride. But now it seems like they're just going to put it right there, right? Okay, so you start talking.
Well, this does bring up some interesting things. We had speculated, we had narrowed it down essentially to three rides. Vortex, Firehawk, and then the Bat. Those are the three rides that we had narrowed it down to the other night. And we speculated on reasons that it could be any of those three. And, the teaser, poster, sign, whatever, the air is eerily calm, could have been connected to any of the three.
Yeah.
It's big, it's gone. I don't know. That maybe lent itself most to Vortex. But we had speculated on all three, and I came down saying, I hope it's Vortex because, Firehawk was a milestone for me. It's the ride that I enjoy the most out of those three rides. Vortex is the ride I enjoy the least out of those three. So I came down saying, I hope it's Vortex, but I know that it is very likely that it is Firehawk because of the rumors we had heard. Now, again, like you said, the rumors we had heard was that this was for next year. So Firehawk, without a doubt, is the most expensive ride to operate, especially when you're doing the dual station configuration. You have pretty much twice the staff. You have it is a lower capacity ride because it is a very long load and unload cycle. It does have a long line most of the time, not necessarily because it's as popular of a ride as much as it is a lower capacity ride. Now, in terms of popularity, Firehawk might be more popular than the Bat just because of location. Yeah. I don't know about Vortex. Vortex is probably still pretty popular. It's an iconic ride there. Firehawk has been around the least amount of time, opening in 2008 as the relocation from Geauga Lake. However, Firehawk is also the ride that has the least number of seasons under its belt as a ride as a whole. The Bat, which opened as Top Gun, came in the early 90s. Vortex came in 86, yeah. I believe. So Vortex is older than either of the other two. Firehawk opened in 2001, I believe, at Geauga Lake and closed in 2006 and then relocated to Kings Island. So 17 seasons, I think.
And I think that's maybe where the conversation starts at, because in the press release sent to different news stations, they said that Firehawk had come to the end of its serviceable life. And to me, that's a big question mark, because 17 years doesn't seem like a whole lot of time. Like, if I'm investing money, and let's say a ride costs $17 million, to run a ride for $1 million a year seems like that's pretty expensive. Now, granted, I understand that Cedar Fair obtained Firehawk in the through a sale of Geauga Lake, that they probably didn't pay. Like, Six Flags paid most of that money, so maybe they don't have that financial connection to the ride, and they feel like they can just burn it in the long run. But I don't know. 17 years doesn't sound like a whole lot of time. We've also heard that possibly Vekoma stopped supporting the ride. because they're possibly doing that new flying coaster. We know they are doing a new flying coaster concept. You can see the prototypes on YouTube all over the place. So we know they're trying something, and maybe they're just not, supplying parts, or maybe the parts are way more expensive than the parks want to spend. So, but 17 years seems like a really short time for a big ride like that to be around.
Yeah, and we've seen things like this before, and we've heard things like this before about rides being at the end of their service life. And it's sort of a buzzword phrase that gets thrown around a lot, because we talk about you hear like Big Bad Wolf, which closed after 25 seasons or 25 years. They said had reached the end of its service life. And, we've got other suspended coasters that were built just a few years after Big Bad Wolf, the Bat being one of them, that has now been around for 10 years more. Yeah. And has a similar season length. So that's a reason to maybe say why it might have been the Bat. So, that seems to be a phrase that gets thrown out there, not necessarily because from an engineering perspective, you've got the term service life and replacement life. And those are two different things. Replacement life is when the product no longer functions and the owner needs to shop for a replacement because the product will no longer do what it is designed to do safely, or it just flat out doesn't work. Service life is in a way defined as the amount of time that passes before a product needs maintenance or needs to be serviced. That's why it's called service life. So in my mind, when they say it has reached the end of its service life, that doesn't mean the ride can't safely operate anymore. That's not what they're talking about here. That simply means that they do not want to front the cost that it would take to keep the ride operational. Maybe someone else will. I don't think this ride is going to Kentucky Kingdom, but let's say for a second it is.
Yeah, well, that's the rumor, isn't it?
Maybe Kentucky Kingdom is willing to spend the money on purchasing Firehawk and moving it, and they're willing to front the cost to maintain that ride. Kentucky Kingdom in 2019 would get a better return on investment on Firehawk than Kings Island would. I don't think there's any arguing that, because it's a new ride there. Your Kings Island folks will go down to Kentucky Kingdom anyways because they're already doing that, and they'll go ride it, and you'll bring new people in. That's fine. But the thing that bothers me about this is if it's at the end of its service life and you don't want to pay the cost to maintain the ride and to keep it operational, that's fine. It's an expensive ride to run. It's an expensive ride to maintain. I'm sure from a parts perspective, like we said, there's only 3 of these rides that have ever been built, and one of them was Nighthawk, the prototype, the Carowinds. We'll get to that in a minute. So in theory, Firehawk and Batwing, which has been closed most of the season, in theory, Firehawk and Batwing have better parts, more reliable parts, and a better design because they were not the prototypes. They were the second iteration. So in theory, Firehawk and Batwing should be in better shape than Nighthawk. So that's fine. But if you're not going to front the cost to maintain it, and you knew what the service life was prior to you needing to do maintenance and buy new parts and all that nonsense, what I want to know is, after 5 years at Geauga Lake, where it operated with 3 trains, you brought it in and installed it in your park, only ran 2 trains. So the assumption there is that you used the 3rd train for parts to reduce your maintenance cost up front. If after doing that, you knew you were only going to get 11 seasons out of this ride, 11 or 12 seasons out of this ride, that ride cost $15 million when it was purchased new. Let's say it cost half of that to get it. Let's say, and I don't know what that number is. It might be 10 million, might be 8 million, might be 5 million. I don't know. Maybe they got a screaming deal on it. If you were going to do that and pay to put it up and then pay again 10 years later to tear it down. And now you're not going to get any what we call in the engineering world salvage value for it because it's reached the end of its service life, and all you're going to do is scrap it. It seems like a waste of time and money to do that, to get 10 years out of a ride, when that $8 or $10 million, whatever, could have been invested in a brand new flying coaster from B&M up front that might cost $8 million, $18 million. You're over halfway there already, and now you have a brand new ride, and B&M's, as far as we know, 30, 40 years or more, we've had no problems with some of the older B&Ms that were built in the early 90s. Just rode Kumba a weekend ago, built in 1993, right? 2003, 2013. That thing's been around 25 years, and it still runs like a champ, okay? And that thing runs pretty much year-round. So why, if you knew that this was going to be the case, did we even go this route to begin with? Really, really puzzles me.
Well, I think you're looking at it from an engineering perspective, but you need to look at it from a political perspective, because when they got Firehawk, it's a different regime. Kinzel had a very different idea about roller coasters, about maintaining coasters, about keeping coasters than the current regime has. This current regime loves to tear out roller coasters. Disaster Transport, Thunder Road, Wildcat, Firehawk. Like, you name it, they've torn out quite a few roller coasters already. That this is not out of the norm for when a coaster, you know, when it starts costing money to replace, to maintain, and when it starts costing time of maintenance crew, they're quick to pull roller coasters in this regime. And back then with Jaga Lake, Kinzel needed to get rides out of that park. Like, they wanted to get rides out of that park. They sent them all over the place. Dominator, X-Flight, you know, all, you know, the
Venom became possessed, you know, they
wanted to get the rides out of that park, and at the same time, Kings Island's new in their portfolio for the most part. This is a big splash for Kings Island. They get a brand new coaster that, you know, that they've never seen before. So I think that's more of a political move than anything. I don't think they're thinking like, hey, you know, what else could we buy? Should we just try and sell this? They wanted stuff out of Jaga as fast as possible. They wanted something to make a splash with some of their newer properties that they just acquired, and this fit the bill. So from a political standpoint, I think it makes sense. And I think it also means that like you said, we don't know how much they paid to obtain some of this stuff and obtain the entire park of Jaga Lake.
And the intention of the old regime may have been that Firehawk was going to run for 25, 30 years. That may have been the intention.
Like they said, hey, we're going to put this here, and this is the intention. And now this new regime is kind of like, we're going to pull rides as soon as they start costing money. And, you know, that's what's happening here. This is nothing new. This is not new. You know, it's the same reason Six Flags RMC'd all their wood coasters, was to cut down on maintenance every day. And what has been the story of 2018? Rides being down across the chain. And one of them. We've seen a number of other rides be one of them. We've seen Witch's Wheel taken out, which was another maintenance nightmare. They are removing rides, and they said they would do this in the last presentation of the investors. They said they're going to start removing rides that are costing money, because I don't know if I'd call it a crisis, but this was not a good season. That even though their last quarter was okay, their numbers overall are still down. They're probably going to be up by the end of the year with Haunt and Winterfest. We're probably going to see a modest increase in attendance. But overall, nowhere where they should be installing the best roller coaster in the world, installing 3 other roller coasters, nowhere where they should be.
No, and I think that relates back to what we talked about at the beginning, where this was a rumor we heard was going to happen next year.
Yeah.
And that this ride was going to be removed next year. And we've heard that Knott's is doing very well. Knott's was absolutely packed the day that I was there, and I was there on a holiday weekend. But we've heard that Cedar Point's attendance has been down. We've heard that Kings Island had very, very poor attendance in the early part of the year and had very poor season pass sales for this season. Kings Island has actually been labeled as one of the major culprits of Cedar Fair's poor performance this season. And if they come back and, attendance was up across the chain by 1% at the end of the year, I'm sorry, that's not good enough, because you spent probably north of $50 million on 4 roller coasters at Cedar Point, Knott's Berry Farm, Kings Dominion, and California's Great America, which we're hearing rumors that their next big project has been canceled. Now, we don't know how much truth there is to that, but certainly it's possible. So we're hearing all this stuff about you're canceling things, you're pulling rides out, and you just spent, Steel Vengeance was probably a $15 to $20 million ride. Twisted Timbers was probably $12 to $15 million. Hang Time was probably about a $10 million ride. Railblazer probably similar. So you're looking at, probably in the ballpark of $50 million, and you're having less people come to your parks than did last year. That is not good. And I think that is a direct reason why, if this was planned for next year, if they say, well, it's an expensive ride, we can save a season of maintenance if we just do it now, and we'll save a little bit of that money that we're not getting this year in attendance and revenue. Well, I think it's a direct effect of what's going on at the turnstiles.
And it's also, you look at like Witch's Wheel, why they pulled that ride. They're not doing anything with that land immediately. It doesn't seem like they're going to do anything immediately with this land. Maybe it makes it easier to prep work for whatever B&M coaster is coming in next. But at the end of the day, this is what they said they were going to do. They're going to cut low-performing rides that have a big maintenance bill, and Firehawk fits that model very closely. Mm-hmm. And the question is, I don't know if Firehawk, if this closing is the story. I think the question is, what's next? Because there's a lot of parks with a lot of aging roller coasters, and maybe ridership is a big deal. They always talk about ridership dictating decisions in Cedar Fair, and maybe, you look at some of the other roller coasters throughout the chain, and you're like, they're safe because they still have ridership, that they're willing to put in the maintenance cost. But here at Firehawk, not a whole lot of people are riding it. It costs a lot of money. And it's going. I think the question is when Nighthawk's going to be the next to go.
Nighthawk has to be a foregone conclusion, right? Because it seems as if you had an extra train from Geauga Lake, and that only got you through 11 years here. Yeah. And, they are different design of trains. I don't know how many common parts there are between the two, when it comes to brakes and, cars and everything. We don't know any of those numbers. But if the intention is to scrap the track and supports and use the cars for parts, Nighthawk is older than Firehawk. Yeah. So in theory, it's probably in worse shape. It's got and that was the prototype.
I say this too. I'm going to like how a new B&M Flyer or B&M Giga looks back there in X-Space, and I'm going to like how a brand new GCI Wooden Coaster is going to look right there over the water in the front of the park. So good riddance, I say to both of them.
Well, that's, that's assuming you get them at this point, because,
who knows, really?
California's Great America is supposed to get a hyper coaster. What if that is indeed canceled, like we're hearing? Who knows what they'll do next?
Who knows, right? So we will keep you updated here on all the latest information coming out of the parks this season. Man, we never thought we'd have this at this point, but here we are, tearing down roller coasters in late September. So
if you would have told me at the end of September last year, a month after we did all these announcements and talked about all these great roller coasters that Cedar Fair was going to build for 2018, if you would have told me a year later we'd be talking about them taking out rides because their attendance was down, I would have said you were absolutely nuts, and you were probably one of the fools on Twitter and Facebook who sends us messages every other day about how this park's getting a Giga and this park's sending something.
You guys are idiots, and
you guys are wrong about this and you're wrong about that. I would have thought you were crazy, but here we are.
Here we are. So, as always, I'm Andrew Barczyk from Chicago, Illinois.
And I'm Danny Miller from Binghamton, New York.
Right on, Ride Warriors.
Thanks, guys.